I'm not attacking or disparaging a religious Jew who says that they have an intimate relationship with God. I'm not your judge. You stand and fall before him. I'm simply telling you that the way you can have a relationship with a wife or with a child or with a best friend in a deeper, more profound and wonderful way, you can have a relationship with God. And I'd also point out that there are more than 1 billion Protestants around the world today, or roughly so, that for them, their authority is what's written in Scripture, their own relationship with God, the leading of the Spirit in their lives. And then there are different traditions, customs, etc., that are passed on, but they're not binding or authoritative. And yet, they find that they don't need to be Catholics or Greek Orthodox or others where you have many more traditions written down. This is not to attack Catholics or Greek Orthodox. It's simply to say that more than 1 billion people are in fundamental harmony about the fundamentals. You travel around the world and get with them and find fundamental harmony about the fundamentals and find they know how to raise children in godly ways. That's only half of them are true believers, or a third of them are true believers. 300 million people, 500 million, whatever. You've got a large amount of people, far larger than the Jewish population combined for centuries and centuries and centuries built up, that are living godly lives, that are following the Scriptures, that are seeking to live lives pleasing. If you start asking them rabbinic questions about their Christian faith, they won't be able to answer those either. As I used as an example the other day, Ephesians 5, singing and making melody in your heart with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. If you do that rabbinic way, well, what songs, what melodies, what time, how loud? What does it mean to sing in your heart? How do we do it? But if you have life in the Spirit relationship and take it as written, you find there's a way to live this out. And in fact, those ultra-Orthodox Jews that have come to Yeshua, sometimes it takes a little while before they realize, hey, I don't need all the scaffolding, and I can actually walk a life in God in a God-fearing way. I'm going to make this last point, and then in the last session, just talk about some of Judaism's strengths, but where it has fallen short, the glorious way of our Messiah. But again, the question is always raised, well, there's so much assimilation. Jews who believe in Jesus automatically assimilate. And we've mentioned that increasingly. There are examples to the contrary of that. But just because a remnant has been preserved, does that prove everything? What if I wanted to play the numbers game the other way? And said, God said to our people Israel that we'd be fruitful and multiply and so on and be so numerous. And yet if you take the Chinese, they're as ancient as we are. The Indian peoples, they're as ancient as we are, roughly speaking. And yet there are over 1 billion Chinese and over 1 billion Indians and maybe 13, 14 million Jews. What if I use the argument of followers of Yeshua, worshipers of the God of Israel through Jesus? What if I want to measure success by numbers? Well, only 12, 13 million of you, 14 million of you, but over 1 billion, or professing Christians, over 2 billion in the world today. What does that prove? In my mind, it doesn't prove anything necessarily. But I do see this, that although God has worked in and through Rabbinic Judaism in certain ways to keep our people through the ages, we've not been kept with divine blessing, but with divine chastisement. One rabbi told me that he believes that a couple of centuries ago, almost all the Jews in the world were traditional. It was the tiniest minority that were not. And I said, well, then why weren't they blessed with a return to the land and all the things that God promised? And where is the Messianic age? We've been preserved, but we've been preserved under judgment and chastisement to this day, and we stand by mercy. Rather than pointing to the greatness of Rabbinic Judaism, we can thank God for the sincerity of many rabbis that cared for their people and cared for the traditions of Israel and cared for the preservation of the Jewish people. But we could say, isn't there more than just preservation? Isn't there more than just somehow surviving as a people? Could it be that there is a greater calling and purpose on our lives in God? As I've often said at Christian rallies, God's purpose and goal is not the preservation of the human race, but the transformation of the human race. I want to close by just asking some honest questions about God's call and purposes for Israel. And we'll close with a word of encouragement that Israel, in fact, according to the sure word of Scripture, will have a mass turning and be saved. The last thing I want to talk about has to do with God's destiny and purpose for Jewish people. Obviously, it's a question I take seriously as a Jew, my wife Jewish. It's a question I take seriously all the more because I see a purpose given by God to our people. We see the constant tension, friction in the Middle East, indicating that there is a great spiritual battle going on, ultimately a battle for Jerusalem and the Jewish people. Over the years, interacting with rabbis, I learned much about Judaism that I did not grow up with. As I stated the very first day, my own upbringing was very shallow, Long Island conservative Judaism. I've learned in many ways to appreciate the richness and the beauty of many of the traditions, even though I categorically say there was no oral law, binding oral law going back to Moses. I have great appreciation for many of the traditions, many of the prayers, many of the customs that have been set in place to keep the people united and preserved in certain ways through the years. I've read stories, moving stories about Orthodox devotion during the Holocaust. I have friends who themselves are Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox Jews. And as I've often said, out of every religion that man has made, I believe Judaism is the very best. However, there is something that comes from above that is even more than the very best that man can devise, even if it has seeds of divine truth and seeds of Scripture truth. I first want to express appreciation for strengths of traditional Judaism. Judaism is sought to be loyal to the one true God, the God of Israel. Many Jews in the Middle Ages died rather than convert to Catholicism. Died with the Shema on their lips. They sought to be loyal to the one true God, the God of Israel, with intensity and devotion. Secondly, Judaism has made observance of the Torah the very foundation of life. Yes, I differ with the rabbinic interpretation of Torah, but I must have a great appreciation for those for whom Torah is a delight and keeping the commands is a delight, who seek to order each area of their lives before God in a way that pleases Him. Does it go beyond what's written in Torah? Yes, but I have great admiration for the heart that loves the law as God's law. Third, Judaism is held tenaciously to the Torah calendar and life cycle. Yes, rabbinic Judaism can teach lessons about adherence to these things. Do I agree with all the Sabbath laws? Of course not. Do I believe without all these Sabbath laws, Sabbath could have been kept? Yes, but rabbinic Jews have certainly led the way through the centuries in making this a priority. I have admiration for this. I've had rabbis tell me that, remember, as a new believer, I made an agreement with this rabbi. I would go and meet with ultra-Orthodox rabbis if he would come with me to a church service. I remember he said to me, Christianity is far more psychologically powerful than Judaism. Your whole teaching and the cross is far more psychologically powerful. I just don't agree with it. We can express appreciation for things in one another's faiths and backgrounds and recognize where they intersect in common ground. So I appreciate this. Judaism has cultivated strong morals and set forth lofty ethical principles. Yeah, they're hypocrites. They're hypocrites everywhere. Yeah, there are people who are just legalists, sure, and more so in a legally based religion. But in many ways, Judaism's cultivated strong morals and set forth lofty ethical principles. Another thing is that Judaism has created a tremendous repository